vamos à terceira conferência da manhã, que vai ser feita pelo Dr. Mayron Cantillo, da Universidade de València. O professor Mayron é professor do Departamento de Filologia Inglesa e Alemã, é daquilo que nós aqui em Lisboa chamamos anglísticos e germanísticos, ou mais, de uma forma mais lata, de germânicas, é filologia germânica. É professor de estudos ingleses, precisamente, na Universidade de València, mas o sentido dele no nosso ciclo de conferências é porque o professor Mayron se tem dedicado essencialmente aos estudos de recepção da antiguidade clássica na literatura inglesa vitoriana, na literatura inglesa do século XIX. Nesse contexto, o Mayron é também membro de um prestigiado grupo de investigação da Universidade de València, que é o GRATUV, que se dedica precisamente ao estudo do teatro clássico, o teatro greco-romano e sua recepção, e do BATWO, que é o British and American Transatlantic Women Writers, porque também se dedica e se interessa pelas mulheres escritoras, precisamente porque ou são as questões do género e dos estudos de género que também têm motivado muita da investigação do professor Mayron Cantillo. É investigador principal do projeto La Ficción Biográfica Neodecimonónica, Género e Ética em la Cultura Transatlântica Contemporânea, e já foi investigador visitante na Universidade de Lille, no Birkbeck College, na Universidade de Londres e na Universidade de Paris-Nanterre. E temos a expectativa de tê-lo no próximo ano na Universidade de Lisboa, também por um ano como investigador visitante. De entre as suas publicações, eu vou destacar James Findlay Henry y el Guernica y la distancia inmediata a la indignación axial, repercusiones internacionales sobre la guerra civil y el franquismo, y Michael Field's Paratextual Poetics, Portraying a Proto-Modernist Sappho, publicado no jornal, na revista Complutense de Estudos Ingleses, Complutense Journal of English Studies, em 2023. Como eu vos disse, os principais interesses científicos são a literatura comparada, questões de género, a recepção clássica, filosofia e literatura, tradição clássica na literatura inglesa e, muito em particular, a recepção de Safo, precisamente, que é também aquilo que hoje motiva a conferência do professor Mayron Cantillo, a saber, Masculinity in Fragments, the Phaon Myth in Michael Field's Poetics of Reversed Sexualities. Creio que o Mayron falará em inglês, mas não, sem problema, porque parece que foi ensinado pelo próprio Carlos III, como verão, não é? Mayron, muitas gracias.
Muito obrigado. I think I have to learn some Portuguese, because if I'm going to do a stay with you, I think I need some Portuguese in the first place. So thank you very much for having me here. It is a pleasure to be with you, Dr. Simões and Joanna. Thank you very much for everything you've done to make this possible. And yes, so the title of my presentation is Masculinity in Fragments, the Phaon Myth in Michael Phaon's Poetics of Reversed Sexualities. And I think there are two ideas I want to explore in a different direction, a different way, but ideas that have been shared here by my colleagues. So I think I want to continue within Sappho's reception with the idea of a dominação do outro, my Portuguese is terrible, pressupõe a sua feminização, kind of thing. And also I think I will use some ideas from Dr. Buscar's talk about, the exemplar on the paradigm, because I think in my reception of Sappho, and what I do in Sappho reception, there's going to be that idea of the exemplar, the idea of the paradigm, that practice I'm in. So let me start. The idea for this conference paper emerged as a part of the research project I carried out last year as a visiting scholar at the UMR Allemagne à l'Université de Lille. Through the intermediation of Dr. Charles Delattre, I had the opportunity to collaborate with members of Universitat. You've got this review sur le genre dans l'Antiquité. And my purpose there was, to study how Sappho had been critically approached as a mythographer and as a mythography. More precisely, the question I sought to address was beyond the connections between Sappho's poetry and myth, I was keen to discover how Sappho herself is appropriated as a myth in her own right every time she's revisited in post-classical literatures, even, and this is significant, even after the philological debunking of the myths attached to her biographical figure. By this I mean, it's very persistent to see that even if we know that Sappho was not that Sappho was not this or not the other thing, you know, even if we know that those myths are not valid biographically, historically speaking, those myths are still used and reused, you know, by writers. By writers who know Greek, by writers who are, you know, in the know of, you know, about classical philology and so on and so forth, like the writers I'm going to talk about today. They know who Sappho was entirely, but they still, you know, continue in the same effort to use Sappho in a very mythical way, even knowing, you know, without even although they know that she's not that mythological persona anymore. So the idea of the Sappho myth persists despite its historical groundlessness. The connections between Sappho's poetry and myth have been explored in depth. Recent studies includes Roger Skodon's and Pura Nieto's chapters in different volumes. There is a book in which we've got Dr. Shimoyes as a co-writer, as a co-author there. Is Claves para el entendimiento de los mitos griegos, and there is a chapter there by Dr. Pura Nieto, about Sappho and myth. There's an interesting chapter about the usage of myth there. So we do know in a clear way that in her poetry, Sappho seems to employ myths as regional stories, as models of existential consolation, or if I want to go in the direction of Dr. Bosca, they are many times used as paradigms of heroic success in the manner that Dr. Bosca has explained to us today. Amongst her best-known fragments dealing with some mythological figures or mythical figures, we've got Helen of Troy, for example, in fragment 16. That's a very famous fragment. Achilles, we've got Tithonus' poem. Of course, the Tithonus poem is a necessary mention, a necessary reference, because we know that there was an amplification, a different papyrus that was found in some 2 decades ago. Yeah, 2 decades ago exactly. And then we've got the Phaon myth, fragment 211. That's an interesting case because it's not really I need to stop there at this point. The last reference in my selection is troublesome. As a Sapphic fragment, 211, it fails to offer any of her words. It doesn't quote from her, but simply informs us that she devoted much of her verse to the beautiful ferryman Phaon. This is problematic, for as Campbell points out in a footnote, his edition of this fragment, there is a confusion of Phaon with Adonis. So it's not really, we can't really say that she mentions Phaon because she never does, okay? The truth is, none of the extant fragments attributed to Sappho refer to Phaon directly, and yet her name is associated with his time and again. So much so that the most popular myth that has since ancient times prevailed in the transmission of her legacy is that of her tragic love for Phaon, the handsome ferryman who disdained her. There are other myths, though, about Sappho. The 10th Muse, according to pseudo-Plato, we say that Plato said that she was the 10th Muse, although we now know that it was not Plato, really. And then there are 2 Sapphos. You remember, there was this theory that there was the Sappho, the writer, and then Sappho, the prostitute, to separate them and to kind of, in a way, avoid thinking about Sappho in transgressive or deviant terms. And then the myth of Sappho, the school mistress, you know, that she was, you know, part of a theasos, and she was, teaching some a group of girls about life, about love, about poetry. Those are myths we know nowadays. They're difficult to validate historically. Nevertheless, it is Sappho's legendary romance with Phaon that has a very long and fertile history. Let me offer you the following canonical overview of her romantic myth in classical literature first, and in its English receptions. Okay, then. So we've got the earliest attested version of the Phaon myth. It's Menander. We've got a fragmentary comedy by the name Leucadia, the girl from Lucas. So we know that there is the myth, you know, there is the myth in Hellenistic Greece, but this myth, of course, is going to gain in popularity and is going to gain in prominence under the authority of Ovid, of course, and his famous epistle of 15. Although, again, everything is so problematic when talking about Sappho, Ovid and his epistle, letter 15, we don't know if he really wrote it. In fact, in the last edition, well, in the last collection about Sappho by Patrick Vinglas, he always, in the Sappho, in Cambridge Companion to Sappho, every reference to the letter is attributed to a pseudo-Ovid. We always use pseudo-Ovid because it's not really clear if he ever wrote that epistle. But yes, according to tradition, we attribute this letter to Ovid. And my authors, the writers I'm going to talk about, they thought it was an Ovidian source. Then, in the case of English literature, we've got the earliest example of the Phaon myth in a play by John Lilly. That's an interesting play about Phaon as a ferryman, Sappho as a member of the court, kind of a princess, and there's a social difference between them. And she's presented as Sappho as Queen Elizabeth I. And the ferryman is that beautiful guy who wants to maybe one of the pirates, or maybe one of the members of the court that were inferior in class, who wanted to court the queen. But then Sappho renounces the love, of the Phaon. Remember that Queen Elizabeth never married. Sappho decided to embrace some kind of a virginity thing, and she becomes a mother to Cupid at the end of the play. It's a weird play, but an interesting one as well. And then another example of the Phaon, of the reception of the Phaon myth that I really love, it's Mary Robinson's sonnets that were published at the end of the 18th century, in the revival of the romantic take on the sonnet. And it's a collection of sonnets, and it's a very intense collection in which Sappho becomes the most significant voice of reason. Of course, she doesn't want to feel this terrible passion anymore. She wants to feel enlightened, the enlightenment, but she can't. So it's this fight, this very romantic fight between reason and passion, between reason and imagination. And then my case, the case I'm going to be sharing with you today, is Michael Phaon's Lonigo. That's an interesting take, that's an interesting approach to the Phaon and Sappho myth, because they knew Greek. By the way, I say they because Michael Phaon is a misnomer, is a pseudonym. Behind this name, we've got two people. We've got Catherine Bradley and her niece, Edith Cooper. They wrote together, they learned Greek in a formal way. They went to university when universities became, opened their doors to women towards the end of the 19th century. And they learned quite a lot of Greek, ancient Greek. And a result of their learning was this interesting example of Sappho reception with a collection of fragments used in the original version. So we're going to see Sappho's Greek, original Greek being used, and we're going to see that even if they knew who Sappho was from a philological perspective, because they consulted historical materials, they still wanted to explore the Phaon myth, although it was a myth. In this conference paper, I show a focus on Lonigo, although it is closely, and this is something that that is complicated about this volume, because the volume is about Sappho, using Sappho's fragments, but at the same time, we've got the large shadow of Ovid's letter. Ovid is there, so you can't cancel him out. If you read the volume, you need to take Sappho into consideration, but also Ovid, and then Homer as well. Homer is going to be present somehow in the volume. To a large extent, indeed, a consistent and extensive part of Michael Phaon's volume can be read as a hybrid dialogue between Sappho's fragments and Ovid's letter. The fragments are overtly present as epigraphs, heading every single composition. The Phaons took the fragments, from H.E. Wharton's popular edition of 1885, which was based in turn on the groundbreaking work of German philologist Theodor Bechth. On the other hand, the presence of Ovid, although not explicit, resonates ubiquitously as one of the most direct interlocutors with the Phaons, and by extension us as readers, the Phaons converse in most of the pieces. So we find Ovid everywhere. The volume's Ovidianism is not merely confined to the famous epistle. The whole Ovidian aesthetics of violence and metamorphosis informs the Phaon's project. Take, for instance, the poems of Tiresias in the volume, Dryope, Leto and Niobe, and of course, and it makes sense that I stop here at this point because there are two poems about Procne and Philomela. And of course, this table has been all about those figures. And Procne and Philomela, in Procne, you've got a poem about her in section in the 10th poem. It's poem 10, and it's a weird poem because in a way Sappho talks to Procne, and she says, "Why do you complain, Procne? You at least you had Euterius. I was all alone. I'm being rejected by my lover. You had a chance to, to be with someone. So be thankful." That's because of course, in a way, she's justifying, the terrible behavior that we know Tereus had. And then in poem 12, we've got the other figure, Philomela, or Philomel, under the name of Philomel. And this poem is all about the curse of having to sing sad songs. And she talks to the, to the nightingale, to the ruiseñor, and she says, "Darling, Philomel, why do you have to keep on singing sad tones, only sad tones? Will you ever become free of those, of that curse that comes to you because of the tradition?" Tradition as curse is an interesting idea, throughout the volume. The Phaons rework all these ideas, all these stories, and their reworkings, their revisitations are unmistakably Ovidian in nature. Let us be more specific and let us revert to the myth of Phaon and Sappho. The Phaons address it in several poems, in spite of the fact that it was a legend, and Bradley and Cooper, Michael Phaon, knew this. Wharton's biographical sketch, the volume they used, the biographical sketch of Sappho very categorically points out that Phaon should in no way be historically related to the lesbian poet. Nonetheless, the Phaons retain the Phaon myth in their rewriting of Sappho's poetry, and they do so in a very Ovidian fashion. Just as Ovid presents us with a mannish Sappho, and I take my cue here from two articles that I really like about Ovid's letter 15. We've got this article by Gordon and then the other by Hallett about Ovid and his representation of Sappho as masculine everywhere. Why is Sappho a man? I love that title because she's going to behave like that as such in our volume as well. So just as Ovid presents us with a mannish, masculine Sappho in his 15th letter, with a lecherous gaze, very active according to Gordon, and very sexually explicit, so do the Phaons depict the lesbian poet not as a mere victim of romantic disdain and despair. Rather, Sappho behaves as a transgressive, possessive, and even fatal lover in long ago. Her desire for Phaon is far from innocent, chaste, or feminine. She embodies power, domination, virility. He instead has his masculinity fragmented, compromised by Sappho's possessive economy of desire to the point of becoming destroyed and emasculated. As I aim to show here, Phaon faces up to the possibility of his symbolic death as a man at the hands of a Sappho turned into a decadent femme fatale who seems to understand desire as violence and subjugation. To approach this particular portrayal of Phaon and Sappho, I propose to examine a selection of nearly 10 lyrics. I'm not going to read all of them. I'm going to, some of them are going to be addressed in passing. I will, of course, focus on 3 poems, poem 2, 3, and 4, in which the Phaons posit a transgressive conception of desire that unsettles the interaction between lover and beloved, subverts gender norms, and situates Sappho in an ambivalent yet entrenched position of power. Let us read lyric 2. I love this one. By the way, the red in the Greek epigraph is not mine. I mean, the very volume wants to emphasize the significance, the sanguine significance of the Sappho original words, and then the English is in kind of in black ink. So you've got the clear contrast, the chromatic contrast between, the words, the blood of Sappho. They even talk about the blood of Sappho and the imitation in English, in black English, as it were. Come, decayed sleep, thou child of night, give me thy dreams, thy lies, lead through the horny portal while the pleasure day denies. Oh, bring the kiss I could not take from lips that would not give. Bring me the heart I could not break, the bliss for which I live. I care not if I slumber blessed by fond delusion. Nay, put me on Phaon's lips to rest and cheat the cruel day. In these three quatrains, Sappho aspires to apprehend her beloved by dreaming him into existence just as an erotic idea, as oniric mimesis, regardless of his truthful reality or regardless of his willingness to be with her. Should this aspiration come true, Phaon will ontologically be internalized and oppressed in an objectifying mode of eroticism. Within her dreams and lies, Sappho's paradigm of love follows the dynamics of absolute power. She reifies her beloved, reduces him to the stasis of a dependent object, and seizes hold of him in an imaginary act that aims to neutralize his painful absence. She feels pain, but at the same time, she neutralizes that pain by saying, I'm going to possess you in my imagination. As a result, what we see in this oniric metaphysics is a transgressive gender performance, one in which Sappho acts as a domineering dreamer. She's a dreamer, she's a liar, while her beloved is implicitly reduced to only an ideal object. Such is Sappho's need to imprison or possess her beloved, that it becomes exponentially enhanced through the Homeric image, line 3, of the horny portal white. That's Homer. Through this image, Michael Phaon is alluding in a combinatory and hybrid way to what Homer presents in Book 19 of his Odyssey as the ivory gate of sleep and the horny gate. You've got the ivory gate of sleep. That's the sleep that you go through in experience of deceit. Those are dreams that tell you nothing about reality. Those are dreams that are false, and you can't extract anything out of that. But then the horny gate, those are the dreams that we like, because those dreams are about the future. They really give us information about the future. But it's interesting because Michael Phaon mixes them both. It's the horny portal white as in ivory. So the door is double. The door is has those two sentences as well. By the way, we've got here, so not just the dialogue between Ovid and Sappho, as I said before, but also Homer is incorporated. This insertion of this epic intertext produces a very cogent idea. Sappho's dreams are endowed with the strategic ambivalence of being both deceitful and potentially conducive to an effective oniric truth. In other words, Sappho's dreams are white and horny at once, to the extent that she knows they're lies. She knows she's going to deceive herself, but her immersion in them, her reality of them, might bring her the erotic fulfillment she so lacks. The takeaway from this first quatrain is clear. In her understanding of desire, Sappho embraces darkness, disease, and dangerous dreams as castrative instruments against her elusive Phaon. The rest of the poem too confirms what we know or what we can work out. A direct equation of female desire with violence against a male object who becomes breakable and thus undergoes an extreme loss of masculinity. Phaon is to be taken, broken, fragmented. In fact, he's never a whole subject or object, but just a fragment, a synecdoche. He's only lips, heart, and nothing more. And some critics, Huffer among them, she says that she likes the labial metaphor. And here, I'm not sure, but I'm going to quote her because she wrote this. I'm not sure about this interpretation myself, but I think it's very sexual, by the way. It's very sexual, but I think it is worth, quoting here. It is through the divergent figure of the lips that Sappho constitutes an iterative labial sexuality. Twice, because lips are mentioned twice, concentrated on Phaon's lips, that conceals an idea of performance or a tacit dream, here I'm going to quote Sappho, of lesbian love making in the infinite combinations of mouth to labia to mouth, labia to labia. That's, this psychoanalytic interpretation. I'm not sure if I agree, but at the same time, I feel tempted to agree. Integrated into this labial and lesbian discourse, now lesbian, not in capital letters, lesbian, in the sense of identity politics that we have. Phaon dies as a man and becomes intrinsically queer to Sappho's eyes. That's an interpretation. I think it's too overdone, but maybe it's possible as well. Clearly enough, in line with the above, Sappho's performance of desire is very complex. Not only does she uphold a firm belief in ontological self-deception as a source of erotic satisfaction, but she also adds a transgression gender view to this same belief. As lyric 2 reveals, especially in its second quatrain, Sappho's erotic metaphysics of dreams and lies is informed by whole synecdochic dialectics in which she breaches all gender conventions, transforms her beloved into a passive object, and portrays herself as a sublime woman. Because she's well aware of her vulnerable position as an unrequited lover, Sappho represents her beloved Phaon as a pair of tempting lips, and that makes him occupy a non-normative space of objectified effeminacy. It may seem a stretch, but the fact that Phaon comes across as an emasculated figure suggests that Sappho's desire is only superficially heteroerotic and potentially homoerotic, in that her beloved stands closer to femininity than to masculinity. Let us read lyric 3 now, which is subtler, sweeter than the previous one, but equally transgressive in its implicit conception of desire. Metemoi meli mete melissa, that's the alliterative epigraph we've got, and the translation, the translation is given in the first line, but then we've got the imitation of the amplification. Oh, no, the honey, nor the bee, yet who can drain the flowers as I, less mad Persephone spoiled the Sicilian bowers, that I first sent in a splendor rove, the rosy oleander grove, or lost in myrtle nook, and veiled thoughts that make Aphrodite pale. Honey nor bee, the tingling quest must that too be denied? Deep in thy bosom I would rest, or golden blossom wide, or poppy wreath, or violet crown. I fling your fiery circlets down. The joys over which bees murmur deep, your Sappho's senses may not steep. Honey, clear, soothing, nectarous, sweet, on which my heart would feed. Give me, O love, the golden mead. I stay my lives long greed. The food in which the gods delight, that glistens, tempting in my sight. Phaon, thy lips, again thy lips, withhold from me the bliss of honey and of bee. The crude meaning of the opening line points to Sappho's tragedy of romantic disjunction, as well as her inability to be a sweet lover or an apian lover. In her denied wish to be either honey or bee, the lyric subject renders her sexuality ambiguous. Binary thinking is debunked, as it were. Sappho tacitly portrays herself as the draining bee or the resultant honey, with no either-or scheme at work. Her desire did not privilege one option over the other, but rather aspires to fulfill them both. Establishing a metaphoric disjunction between honey and bee, tantamount to the passivity-activity dichotomy, she suspends the opposition between both terms and vouches for a coveted intertwining of the two. The penetrative bee, which drains and pollinates flowers, and the honey, which is produced and depleted, lose their antithetical values. However, the apian symbolism of sexual action seems to be reinforced in an unexpected way by the reference to Persephone in line 3. And you will see why I say unexpected. The allusion to the queen of the underworld enhances and subverts the erotic nature of the poem. Persephone intervenes as an unfortunate girl, it does not intervene as an unfortunate girl kidnapped by Hades, but as an active figure of natural aggression, comparable to a bee spoiling or draining flowers. The Phaeons put the original myth upside down. Hades is an absence. His sexual violence is replaced with Persephone's agency and freedom in the middle of the wilderness. It is her story that gains full centrality in poem 3, where Sappho seems to be evoking the initial portrayal of the goddess of Persephone in the Homeric hymn to Demeter. I'm going to quote, "She played with the deep-breasted daughters of ocean, plucking flowers in the lush meadow, roses, crocuses, and lovely violets, irises and hyacinths, and the narcissus, which earth grew as snare for the flower-faced maiden in order to gratify by Zeus' design the host to many, a flower wondrous and bright, awesome for all to see, for the immortals above and for mortals below." She's a player, she's an active subject in this case, and that's the moment Michael Field wants to emphasize, not the rape, not the abduction by Hades, but that moment of freedom, that of female agency, she being the protagonist, in the middle of the meadow. The allusion to Aphrodite in line 8. Now, Aphrodite is going to complicate things further. The goddess reinforces the symbolic analogies between the bee, Persephone, and Sappho. In some versions of her myth, Aphrodite destroys a king who mated her, with her on a mountain top as a queen bee, I'm quoting, destroys the drone by tearing out his sexual organs. Her power of castration, Aphrodite's power, which originates in her own birth from Urania's mutilated genitalia, also affects the priest who worship her as a queen bee, only after having performed acts of ecstatic self-castration. As a vicious lover, the goddess stings, emasculates, and even gives symbolic or actual death to her male followers. In the remaining stanzas of the poem, Sappho continues exploring her radical approach to desire in a paradoxical idiom that conflates the delicacy of flowers and honey with an assertive erotic pragmatics of drainage, assault, flinging, penetration, and ultimate consumption, as if it were food. The paradox of this idiom lies precisely in a well-wrought fusion of superficial connotations of vegetative grace and tenderness with implications of belligerence and violence. With Sappho's insistence on Aphroditean excess and veracity, she suggests that her desire would reduce her beloved to a totalizing regime of domination. Phaon would see his sense of freedom or individual integrity at risk of extinction. Sorry, I didn't show you the rest of the poem. In poem 4, Sappho's extreme art sanatorium gains in further imagery and symbolism. Where with the boats the fishers land grew golden pulse along the sand. He tangled Phaon's feet away, spurned the trails and would not stay. Stems and yellow flowers in vain withheld him. Can my arms detain the fugitive? If that might be, if I could win him from the sea, then subtly I would draw him down mid the bright vetches in a crown. My art should teach him to entwine the thievish rings and keep him mine. Lyric 4 can be viewed as a topographical poem in which each spatial element plays a significant tropological part. Each space is a suggestive and dramatic trope. Nature becomes personified as Sappho's pathetic ally in her attempt to seize hold of Phaon. The shore is represented initially as a tense space of momentary mediation and limited hope, and then as a battleground of voracious yet impossible desire. The sea turns into Sappho's nemesis and Phaon's dominion of freedom and safety. The mainland, in contrast, can be pictured as Sappho's tragic stage of lovelessness. In lyric 4, the Phaons depict both nature and the Greek heroine, not in keeping with the orthodox gender roles that we have seen, but in a radical transgressive way that renders the all-feminine binary between feminine and masculine utterly invalid. Sappho is represented as a serpentine plant, the golden pulse that grew along the sand. A creeper, even a snake, she creeps along the sand, reaches down to the shore, and strives to entrap Phaon's feet. Inevitably, this dramatic trope conjures up the archetypal image of the serpent woman, of course, reminiscent of Medusa and Lilith, Melusina, who are usually portrayed as agents of fascination, allegories of evil, and incarnations of deception, destruction, and decay. Common to these agents is their existential purpose to entice, ensnare, enslaved, and emasculate men. Once again, it becomes clear that while the new Phaon is now tacitly described as an objectified, elusive, and coy pseudo-subject, as it were, the new Sappho becomes a sublime, dominant, and violent lover. She's an Ovidian Sappho, mannish in her frustrated desire. Here and there are the lyrics of Lonigo, contribute to this Ovidian narrative of Sappho as aggressor and Phaon as her prey. My selection of other poems includes the following. Poem 32, in which we've got Sappho as Cupid, and the whole collection contains more than 68 poems. So it's a very long collection, and it's hard to because it's not a linear collection. You've got different topics everywhere, and there's not a sense of narrative linearity. You've got to look for patterns here and there. So we've got poem 32, in which Sappho becomes Cupid, as it were. She plays the role of Cupid. She attacks Phaon with her arrows, and she wishes to make him suffer as she does. Love in this case is clearly represented as pain, coercion, and always aggression. My favorite poem, I keep on saying that everyone's my favorite, but my true favorite one is poem 52. And that's a famous poem, very, very, very famous. It's the Tiresian poem. It's about Tiresias. And this is a very, very Ovidian poem. And Sappho in this poem seeks to embody Medea's penetrative charm. She wants heroes to mold and subjugate in a clear way. Like in New Daphne, I love the rewriting of the Daphne myth, because Daphne now chooses Apollo and finds pleasure in him. It's not the other way around, as we know. Here, the feminine is a powerful and penetrative and dangerous force that converts women into femme fatales and into potential menaces against men. This is poem 49. I think it's wrong, this one. And in these cases, I want to go back to the idea that Bosca gave us before, the idea of the exemplum, because all of these poems act as such, paradigmatically. What is different is I think that the emotion they explore is not to be taken as an universal emotion, but it's a very particular emotion only to be applied to Sappho's plight, to Sappho's situation of lovelessness. So we've got another rewriting of the myth of Selene and Endymion. The Greek goddess of the moon falls for the beautiful shepherd we know Endymion and subjugates him to her voracious desire, to the point of turning him into an unconscious, castrated. I love him because he only sleeps throughout the poem, and she takes advantage of him, in that position. So it's a very brutal kind of scene. Then in poem 64, we've got a vindictive Sappho who appears to regard Phaon's demise. In a way, she wishes him dead. And she sees his death as highly plausible and even as a deserved fate. He had it coming. He deserved that. Owing to his character and his hubris. When his death comes to pass, Phaon will be neither remembered, and she kind of takes delight in saying this: I won't sing about you. Nobody will remember you. No memorial will bear your name. Phaon will become nobody as the result of his refusal to love Sappho. So had you loved me, you would have become, somebody. You would have become an eternal presence. Now, point 65 now, Michael Phaon's Sappho uses myth to implicitly portray herself as the very fire that Prometheus stole, the fever that Zeus sent against humankind, and the malicious heat that Pandora carried with her. As the erotic personification of fire, Sappho wishes to excite and burn her indifferent Phaon. She invites him to accept, I quote, the furious curse of love. Then in poem 66, we've got 64, 65, and 66. In the same way as I have analyzed 2, 3, and 4, we've got another cycle, 64, 63, 65, and 66, in a very similar narrative way. After learning that Phaon has left for Sicily, Sappho shows a despair that will grow violent and vengeful. Her sorrow does not involve inert, passive melancholy. It develops into a lethal medley of anger, revenge, and sheer cruelty. Sappho calls upon the goddess of the underworld, Persephone, to paralyze and entomb Phaon, kill him with her. Then Sappho invokes the god of Apollo to intercede in her favor and satisfy her need for vengeance by subjecting Phaon to the suffering she has been undergoing all along. Now, some conclusions. In Sappho's imagination, Phaon is an ambivalent figure in that he stands in a fictive liminal ontology between the ecstatic life that he confers upon Sappho, and the potential death he might undergo in her hands. Because this is something clear. What if I am Phaon, and what if I accept you, Sappho? The problem, if I accept you, you're going to kill me because of your desire. Your desire is so burning, is burning so much, your desire is so intense, that I think I feel sometimes for poor Phaon. He saw this crazy woman, loving him so much. That kind of love is not healthy at all. It's what we call now toxic, this famous word that we use constantly to define our bad relationships. So for one thing, Phaon represents a boundless sensuality. He plays the role of this coy lady. He becomes the lady that's sensual, but she doesn't want to be touched. In that way, he's very much feminized. He's a tempting feast. He's a violent fire that kindles Sappho's desire. For another, his erotic power comes to naught when confronted with Sappho's romantic idealism. In her mind, Phaon falls victim to a voracious imagination that understands eros as possession and annihilation, really. their images, consist a narrative around the Phaon and Sappho myth, one that establishes that heterosexual desire is inherently, according to Michael Field, of course, fanatic, death-driven, that harms lover and beloved equally, Sappho and Phaon in equal measure. Far from vital and fertile, heterosexual desire becomes correlated in the imago with failure, sterility, violence, and ultimate death. Phaon is in the main a petrified subjectivity in Michael Fion's verse. Assuming the most hostile form of otherness, Sappho reduces her beloved and equates her love to a violent art amatoria, ideally imposed on him. He loses his autonomy, we know this, under her gaze. Hers is a reductive gaze that objectifies Phaon, robbing him of his will and imposing upon him an emasculated role that only seeks to satisfy Sappho's desire. In this manner, the gorgeous boatman becomes a feeble and vulnerable subject, appropriated by the fatal otherness that Sappho personifies. For her, Phaon, and that's the final poem, must die as an individual poem, as an individual man, and as an independent self, as it were, in order to fulfill her radical erotic idealism. In a way, Sappho, and this is something I said before, but in a different way, Sappho and Phaon seem to form a tragic couple that reveals how the romantic idiom intrinsic to heterosexuality constitutes a possible language of death. Thank you very much.